Curdie sat and watched every motion of the sleeping king. All the night, to his ear, the palace lay as quiet as a nursery of healthful children. At sunrise he called the princess. "How has his majesty slept?" were her first words as she entered the room. "Quite quietly," answered Curdie. "That is, since the doctor was got rid of." "How did you manage that?" inquired Irene, and Curdie had to tell all about it. "How terrible!" she said. "Did it not startle the king dreadfully?" "It did, rather. I found him getting out of bed, sword in hand." "The brave old man!" cried the princess. "Not so old," said Curdie, "as you will soon see. He went off again in a minute or so, but for a little while he was restless, and once when he lifted his hand it came down on the spikes of his crown, and he half waked." "But where is the crown?" cried Irene in sudden terror. "I stroked his hands," answered Curdie, "and took the crown from them, and ever since he has slept quietly, and again smiled in his sleep." "I have never seen him do that," said the princess. "But what have you done with the crown, Curdie?" "Look," said Curdie, moving away from the bedside. Irene followed him, and there, in the middle of the floor, she saw a strange sight. Lena lay at full length, fast asleep, her tail stretched out straight behind her, and her forelegs before her. Between the two paws meeting in front of it, her nose just touching it behind, glowed and flashed the crown, like a nest for the hummingbirds of heaven. Irene gazed, and looked up with a smile. "But what if the thief were to come, and she not to wake?" she said. "Shall I try her?" And as she spoke, she stooped towards the crown. "No, no, no," said Curdie, terrified. "She would frighten you out of your wits. I would do it to show you, but she would wake your father. You have no conception with what a roar she would spring at my throat. But you shall see how lightly she wakes the moment I speak to her. Lena." She was on her feet the same instant, with her great tail sticking out straight behind her, just as it had been lying. "Good dog," said the princess, and patted her head. Lena wagged her tail solemnly, like the boom of an anchored sloop. Irene took the crown, and laid it where the king would see it when he woke. "Now, princess," said Curdie, "I must leave you for a few minutes. You must bolt the door, please, and not open it to anyone." Away to the cellar he went with Lena, taking care, as they passed through the servants' hall, to get her a good breakfast. In about 1 minute she had eaten what he gave her, and looked up in his face. It was not more she wanted, but work. So out of the cellar they went through the passage, and Curdie into the dungeon, where he pulled up Lena, opened the door, let her out, and shut it again behind her. As he reached the door of the king's chamber, Lena was flying out of the gate of Gwynstorm as fast as her mighty legs could carry her. "What's come to the wench?" growled the men servants, one to another, when the chambermaid appeared among them the next morning. There was something in her face which they could not understand, and did not like. "Are we all dirt?" they said. "What are you thinking about? Have you seen yourself in the glass this morning, miss?" She made no answer. "Do you want to be treated as you deserve, or will you speak, you hussy?" said the first woman cook. "I would fain know what right you have to put on a face like that." "You won't believe me," said the girl. "Of course not. What is it?" "I must tell you, whether you believe me or not," she said. "Of course you must." "It is this, then. If you do not repent of your bad ways, you are all going to be punished, all turned out of the palace together." "A mighty punishment," said the butler. "A good riddance, say I, of the trouble of keeping minxes like you in order. And why, pray, should we be turned out? What have I to repent of now, your holiness?" "That you know best yourself," said the girl. "A pretty piece of insolence! How should I know, forsooth, what a menial like you has got against me? There are people in this house, oh, I'm not blind to their ways. But everyone for himself, say I. Pray, misjudgment, who gave you such an impertinent message to his majesty's household?" "One who is come to set things right in the king's house." "Right indeed!" cried the butler. But that moment the thought came back to him of the roar he had heard in the cellar, and he turned pale and was silent. The steward took it up next. "And pray, pretty prophetess," he said, attempting to chuck her under the chin, "what have I got to repent of?" "That you know best yourself," said the girl. "You have but to look into your books or your heart." "Can you tell me, then, what I have to repent of?" said the groom of the chambers. "That you know best yourself," said the girl once more. "The person who told me to tell you said the servants of this house had to repent of thieving, and lying, and unkindness, and drinking, and they will be made to repent of them one way, if they don't do it of themselves another." Then arose a great hubbub, for by this time all the servants in the house were gathered about her, and all talked together in towering indignation. "Thieving indeed!" cried one. "A pretty word in a house where everything is left lying about in a shameless way, tempting poor innocent girls! A house where nobody cares for anything, or has the least respect to the value of property!" "I suppose you envied me this brooch of mine," said another. "There was just a half-sheet of note-paper about it, not a scrap more, in a drawer that's always open in the writing-table in the study. What sort of a place is that for a jewel? Can you call it stealing to take a thing from such a place as that? Nobody cared a straw about it. It might as well have been in the dust-hole. If it had been locked up, then, to be sure." "Drinking," said the chief porter, with a husky laugh. "And who wouldn't drink when he had a chance? Or who would repent it, except that the drink was gone? Tell me that, Miss Innocence." "Lying," said a great coarse footman. "I suppose you mean when I told you yesterday you were a pretty girl when you didn't pout. Lying indeed! Tell us something worth repenting of. Lying is the way of Gwyntystorm. You should have heard Jabez lying to the cook last night. He wanted a sweetbread for his pup, and pretended it was for the princess. Ha ha ha!" "Unkindness! I wonder who's unkind, going and listening to any stranger against her fellow servants, and then bringing back his wicked words to trouble them," said the oldest and worst of the housemaids. "One of ourselves, too! Come, you hypocrite! This is all an invention of yours and your young man's, to take your revenge on us because we found you out in a lie last night. Tell true now! Wasn't it the same that stole the loaf and the pie that sent you with the impudent message?" As she said this, she stepped up to the housemaid, and gave her, instead of time to answer, a box on the ear that almost threw her down, and whoever could get at her began to push and hustle and pinch and punch her. "You invite your fate," she said quietly. They fell furiously upon her, drove her along the hall with kicks and blows, hustled her along the passage, and threw her down the stair to the wine cellar, then locked the door at the top of it, and went back to their breakfast. In the meantime, the king and the princess had had their bread and wine, and the princess, with Curdie's help, had made the room as tidy as she could. They were terribly neglected by the servants. And now Curdie set himself to interest and amuse the king, and prevent him from thinking too much, in order that he might the sooner think the better. Presently, at his majesty's request, he began from the beginning, and told everything he could recall of his life, about his father and mother and their cottage on the mountain, of the inside of the mountain and the work there, about the goblins and his adventures with them. When he came to finding the princess and her nurse overtaken by the twilight on the mountain, Irene took up her share of the tale, and told all about herself to that point, and then Curdie took it up again, and so they went on, each fitting in the part that the other did not know, thus keeping the hoop of the story running straight. And the king listened with wondering and delighted ears, astonished to find what he could so ill comprehend, yet fitting so well together from the lips of the two narrators. At last, with the mission given him by the wonderful princess and his consequent adventures, Curdie brought up the whole tale to the present moment. Then a silence fell, and Curdie and Irene thought the king was asleep. But he was far from it. He was thinking about many things. After a long pause, he said, "Now at last, my children, I am compelled to believe many things I could not and do not yet understand. things I used to hear and sometimes see as often as I visited my mother's home. Once, for instance, I heard my mother say to her father, speaking of me, 'He is a good, honest boy, but he will be an old man before he understands.' And my grandfather answered, 'Keep up your heart, child. My mother will look after him.' I thought often of their words, and the many strange things besides I both heard and saw in that house. But by degrees, because I could not understand them, I gave up thinking of them. And indeed, I had almost forgotten them, when you, my child, talking that day about the Queen Irene and her pigeons, and what you had seen in her garret, brought them all back to my mind in a vague mass. But now they keep coming back to me, one by one, every one for itself, and I shall just hold my peace and lie here quite still, and think about them all till I get well again." What he meant they could not quite understand, but they saw plainly that already he was better. "Put away my crown," he said. "I am weary of seeing it, and have no more any fear of its safety." They put it away together, withdrew from the bedside, and left him in peace. There was nothing now to be dreaded from Dr. Kelman, but it made Curdie anxious, as the evening drew near, to think that not a soul belonging to the court had been to visit the king or ask how he did that day. He feared in some shape or other a more determined assault. He had provided himself a place in the room to which he might retreat upon approach, and whence he could watch, but not once had he had to betake himself to it. Towards night the king fell asleep. Curdie thought more and more uneasily of the moment when he must again leave them for a little while. Deeper and deeper fell the shadows. No one came to light the lamp. The princess drew her chair close to Curdie. She would rather it were not so dark, she said. She was afraid of something, she could not tell what, nor could she give any reason for her fear, but that all was so dreadfully still. When it had been dark about an hour, Curdie thought Lena might be returned, and reflected that the sooner he went, the less danger was there of any assault while he was away. There was more risk of his own presence being discovered, no doubt, but things were now drawing to a crisis, and it must be run. So, telling the princess to lock all the doors of the bedchamber, and let no one in, he took his mattock, and with here a run, and there a halt under cover, gained the door at the head of the cellar stair in safety. To his surprise he found it locked, and the key was gone. There was no time for deliberation. He felt where the lock was, and dealt it a tremendous blow with his mattock. It needed but a second to dash the door open. Someone laid a hand on his arm. "Who is it?" said Curdie. "I told you they wouldn't believe me, sir," said the housemaid. "I have been here all day." He took her hand and said, "You are a good, brave girl. Now come with me, lest your enemies imprison you again." He took her to the cellar, locked the door, lighted a bit of candle, gave her a little wine, told her to wait there till he came, and went out the back way. Swiftly he swung himself up into the dungeon. Lena had done her part. The place was swarming with creatures, animal forms wilder and more grotesque than ever ramped in nightmare dream. Close by the hole, waiting his coming, her green eyes piercing the gulf below, Lena had but just laid herself down when he appeared. All about the vault and up the slope of the rubbish heap lay and stood and squatted the 49 whose friendship Lena had conquered in the wood. They all came crowding about Curdie. He must get them into the cellar as quickly as ever he could, but when he looked at the size of some of them, he feared it would be a long business to enlarge the hole sufficiently to let them through. At it he rushed, hitting vigorously at its edge with his mattock. At the very first blow came a splash from the water beneath, but ere he could heave a third, a creature like a tapir, only that the grasping point of its proboscis was hard as the steel of Curdie's hammer, pushed him gently aside, making room for another creature, with a head like a great club, which it began banging upon the floor with terrible force and noise. After about a minute of this battery, the tapir came up again, shoved Clubhead aside, and putting its own head into the hole, began gnawing at the sides of it with the finger of its nose, in such a fashion that the fragments fell in a continuous gravelly shower into the water. In a few minutes the opening was large enough for the biggest creature amongst them to get through it. Next came the difficulty of letting them down. Some were quite light, but the half of them were too heavy for the rope, not to say for his arms. The creatures themselves seemed to be puzzling where or how they were to go. One after another of them came up, looked down through the hole, and drew back. Curdie thought if he let Lena down, perhaps that would suggest something. Possibly they did not see the opening on the other side. He did so, and Lena stood lighting up the entrance of the passage with her gleaming eyes. One by one the creatures looked down again, and one by one they drew back, each standing aside to glance at the next, as if to say, "Now you have a look." At last it came to the turn of the serpent with the long body, the 4 short legs behind, and the little wings before. No sooner had he poked his head through, than he poked it farther through, and farther yet, until there was little more than his legs left in the dungeon. By that time he had got his head and neck well into the passage beside Lena. Then his legs gave a great waddle and spring, and he tumbled himself, far as there was betwixt them, heels over head into the passage. "That is all very well for you, Mr. Lake Serpent," thought Curdie to himself, "but what is to be done with the rest?" He had hardly time to think it, however, before the creature's head appeared again through the floor. He caught hold of the bar of iron to which Curdie's rope was tied, and settling it securely across the narrowest part of the irregular opening, held fast to it with his teeth. It was plain to Curdie, from the universal hardness amongst them, that they must all, at one time or another, have been creatures of the mines. He saw at once what this one was after. He had planted his feet firmly upon the floor of the passage, and stretched his long body up and across the chasm to serve as a bridge for the rest. He mounted instantly upon his neck, threw his arms round him as far as they would go, and slid down in ease and safety, the bridge just bending a little as his weight glided over it. But he thought some of the creatures would try his teeth. One by one the oddities followed, and slid down in safety. When they seemed to be all landed, he counted them. There were but 48. Up the rope again he went, and found one which had been afraid to trust himself to the bridge, and no wonder, for he had neither legs, nor head, nor arms, nor tail. He was just a round thing, about 1 foot in diameter, with a nose and mouth and eyes on one side of the ball. He had made his journey by rolling as swiftly as the fleetest of them could run. The back of the Lake Serpent not being flat, he could not quite trust himself to roll straight and not drop into the gulf. Curdie took him in his arms, and the moment he looked down through the hole, the bridge made itself again, and he slid into the passage in safety, with Ballbody in his bosom. He ran first to the cellar, to warn the girl not to be frightened at the avengers of wickedness. Then he called to Lena to bring in her friends. One after another they came trooping in, till the cellar seemed full of them. The housemaid regarded them without fear. "Sir," she said, "there is one of the pages I don't take to be a bad fellow." "Then keep him near you," said Curdie. "And now, can you show me a way to the king's chamber, not through the servants' hall?" "There is a way through the chamber of the colonel of the guard," she answered, "but he is ill and in bed." "Take me that way," said Curdie. By many ups and downs and windings and turnings, she brought him to a dimly lighted room, where lay an elderly man asleep. His arm was outside the coverlid, and Curdie gave his hand a hurried grasp as he went by. His heart beat for joy, for he had found a good, honest human hand. "I suppose that is why he is ill," he said to himself. It was now close upon supper time, and when the girl stopped at the door of the king's chamber, he told her to go and give the servants one warning more. "Say the messenger sent you," he said. "I will be with you very soon." The king was still asleep. Curdie talked to the princess for a few minutes, told her not to be frightened whatever noises she heard, only to keep her door locked till he came, and left her. By the time the girl reached the servants' hall, they were seated at supper. A loud, confused exclamation arose when she entered. No one made room for her. All stared with unfriendly eyes. A page, who entered the next minute by another door, came to her side. "Where do you come from, hussy?" shouted the butler, and knocked his fist on the table with a loud clang. He had gone to fetch wine, had found the stair door broken open and the cellar door locked, and had turned and fled. Amongst his fellows, however, he had now regained what courage could be called his. "From the cellar," she replied. "The messenger broke open the door and sent me to you again." "The messenger? Pooh! What messenger?" "The same who sent me before to tell you to repent." "What! Will you go fooling it still? Haven't you had enough of it?" cried the butler in a rage, and starting to his feet, drew near threateningly. "I must do as I am told," said the girl. "Then why don't you do as I tell you, and hold your tongue?" said the butler. "Who wants your preachments? If anybody here has anything to repent of, isn't that enough, and more than enough for him? But you must come bothering about, and stirring up, till not a drop of quiet will settle inside him. You come along with me, young woman. We'll see if we can't find a lock somewhere in the house that'll hold you in." "Hands off, Mr. Butler," said the page, and stepped between. "Oh ho!" cried the butler, and pointed his fat finger at him. "That's you, is it, my fine fellow? So it's you that's up to her tricks, is it?" The youth did not answer, only stood with flashing eyes fixed on him, until, growing angrier and angrier, but not daring a step nearer, he burst out with rude but quavering authority. "Leave the house, both of you! Be off, or I'll have Mr. Steward to talk to you! Threaten your masters, indeed! Out of the house with you, and show us the way you tell us of!" 2 or 3 of the footmen got up and ranged themselves behind the butler. "Don't say I threaten you, Mr. Butler," expostulated the girl from behind the page. "The messenger said I was to tell you again, and give you one chance more." "Did the messenger mention me in particular?" asked the butler, looking the page unsteadily in the face. "No, sir," answered the girl. "I thought not. I should like to hear him." "Then hear him now," said Curdie, who that moment entered at the opposite corner of the hall. "I speak of the butler in particular when I say that I know more evil of him than of any of the rest. He will not let either his own conscience or my messenger speak to him. I therefore now speak myself. I proclaim him a villain and a traitor to his majesty the king. But what better is any one of you who cares only for himself, eats, drinks, takes good money, and gives vile service in return, stealing and wasting the king's property, and making of the palace, which ought to be an example of order and sobriety, a disgrace to the country?" For a moment all stood astonished into silence by this bold speech from a stranger. True, they saw by his mattock over his shoulder that he was nothing but a miner boy, yet for a moment the truth told notwithstanding. Then a great roaring laugh burst from the biggest of the footmen, as he came shouldering his way through the crowd towards Curdie. "Yes, I'm right," he cried. "I thought as much. This messenger, forsooth, is nothing but a gallows bird, a fellow the city marshal was going to hang, but unfortunately put it off till he should be starved enough to save rope and be throttled with a pack-thread. He broke prison, and here he is preaching." As he spoke, he stretched out his great hand to lay hold of him. Curdie caught it in his left hand, and heaved his mattock with the other. Finding, however, nothing worse than an ox-hoof, he restrained himself, stepped back a pace or 2, shifted his mattock to his left hand, and struck him a little smart blow on the shoulder. His arm dropped by his side. He gave a roar and drew back. His fellows came crowding upon Curdie. One called to the dogs, others swore, the women screamed, the footmen and pages got round him in a half circle, which he kept from closing by swinging his mattock, and here and there threatening a blow. "Whoever confesses to having done anything wrong in this house, however small, however great, and means to do better, let him come to this corner of the room," he cried. None moved but the page, who went towards him skirting the wall. When they caught sight of him, the crowd broke into a hiss of derision. "There, see! Look at the sinner! He confesses! Actually confesses! Come, what was it you stole? The barefaced hypocrite! There's your sort to set up for reproving other people! Where's the other now?" But the maid had left the room, and they let the page pass, for he looked dangerous to stop. Curdie had just put him betwixt him and the wall, behind the door, when in rushed the butler with the huge kitchen poker, the point of which he had blown red hot in the fire, followed by the cook with his longest spit. Through the crowd, which scattered right and left before them, they came down upon Curdie. Uttering a shrill whistle, he caught the poker a blow with his mattock, knocking the point to the ground, while the page behind him started forward, and seizing the point of the spit, held on to it with both hands, the cook kicking him furiously. Ere the butler could raise the poker again, or the cook recover the spit, with a roar to terrify the dead, Lena dashed into the room, her eyes flaming like candles. She went straight at the butler. He was down in a moment, and she on the top of him, wagging her tail over him like a lioness. "Don't kill him, Lena," said Curdie. "Oh, Mr. Miner!" cried the butler. "Put your foot on his mouth, Lena," said Curdie. "The truth fear tells is not much better than her lies." The rest of the creatures now came stalking, rolling, leaping, gliding, hobbling into the room, and each as he came took the next place along the wall, until, solemn and grotesque, all stood ranged, awaiting orders. And now some of the culprits were stealing to the doors nearest them. Curdie whispered the two creatures next to him. Off went Ballbody, rolling and bounding through the crowd like a spent cannon shot, and when the foremost reached the door to the corridor, there he lay at the foot of it, grinning. To the other scuttled a scorpion, as big as a huge crab. The rest stood so still that some began to think they were only boys dressed up to look awful. They persuaded themselves they were only another part of the housemaid and page's vengeful contrivance, and their evil spirits began to rise again. Meantime, Curdie had, with a second sharp blow from the hammer of his mattock, disabled the cook, so that he yielded the spit with a groan. He now turned to the avengers. "Go at them," he said. The whole 49 obeyed at once, each for himself and after his own fashion. A scene of confusion and terror followed. The crowd scattered like a dance of flies. The creatures had been instructed not to hurt much, but to hunt incessantly, until every one had rushed from the house. The women shrieked and ran hither and thither through the hall, pursued each by her own horror, and snapped at by every other in passing. If one threw herself down in hysterical despair, she was instantly poked or clawed or nibbled up again. Though they were quite as frightened at first, the men did not run so fast, and by some of them, finding they were only glared at and followed and pushed, began to summon up courage once more, and with courage came impudence. The taper had the big footman in charge. The fellow stood stock still and let the beast come up to him, then put out his finger and playfully patted his nose. The taper gave the nose a little twist, and the finger lay on the floor. Then indeed the footman ran, and did more than run, but nobody heeded his cries. Gradually the avengers grew more severe, and the terrors of the imagination were fast yielding to those of sensuous experience, when a page, perceiving one of the doors no longer guarded, sprang at it and ran out. Another and another followed. Not a beast went after, until, one by one, they were every one gone from the hall, and the whole meany in the kitchen. There they were beginning to congratulate themselves that all was over, when in came the creatures, trooping after them, and the second act of their terror and pain began. They were flung about in all directions, their clothes were torn from them, they were pinched and scratched any and everywhere. Ballbody kept rolling up them and over them, confining his attentions to no one in particular. The scorpion kept grabbing at their legs with his huge pincers. A 3-foot centipede kept screwing up their bodies, nipping as he went. Varied as numerous were their woes, nor was it long before the last of them had fled from the kitchen to the sculleries. But thither also they were followed, and there again they were hunted about. They were bespattered with the dirt of their own neglect. They were soused in the stinking water that had boiled greens. They were smeared with rancid dripping. Their faces were rubbed in maggots. I dare not tell all that was done to them. At last they got the door into a backyard open, and rushed out. Then first they knew that the wind was howling, and the rain falling in sheets. But there was no rest for them even there. Thither also they were followed by the inexorable avengers, and the only door here was a door out of the palace. Out every soul of them was driven, and left, some standing, some lying, some crawling, to the farther buffeting of the waterspouts and whirlwinds ranging every street of the city. The door was flung to behind them, and they heard it locked and bolted and barred against them. As soon as they were gone, Curdie brought the creatures back to the servants' hall, and told them to eat up everything on the table. It was a sight to see them all standing round it, except such as had to get upon it, eating and drinking, each after its fashion, without a smile, or a word, or a glance of fellowship in the act. A very few moments served to make everything eatable vanish, and then Curdie requested them to clean the house, and the page who stood by to assist them. Every one set about it except Ballbody. He could do nothing at cleaning, for the more he rolled, the more he spread the dirt. Curdie was curious to know what he had been, and how he had come to be such as he was, but he could only conjecture that he was a gluttonous alderman whom nature had treated homeopathically. And now there was such a cleaning and clearing out of neglected places, such a burying and burning of refuse, such a rinsing of jugs, such a swilling of sinks, and such flushing of drains, as would have delighted the eyes of all true housekeepers and lovers of cleanliness generally. Curdie meantime was with the king, telling him all he had done. They had heard a little noise, but not much, for he had told the avengers to repress outcry as much as possible, and they had seen to it that the more anyone cried out, the more he had to cry out upon, while the patient ones they scarcely hurt at all. Having promised his Majesty and her Royal Highness a good breakfast, Curdie now went to finish the business. The courtiers must be dealt with. A few who were the worst, and the leaders of the rest, must be made examples of. The others should be driven from their beds to the street. He found the chiefs of the conspiracy holding a final consultation in the smaller room off the hall. These were the Lord Chamberlain, the Attorney General, the Master of the Horse, and the King's private secretary. The Lord Chancellor and the rest, as foolish as faithless, were but the tools of these. The housemaid had shown him a little closet, opening from a passage behind, where he could overhear all that passed in that room, and now Curdie heard enough to understand that they had determined, in the dead of that night, rather in the deepest dark before the morning, to bring a certain company of soldiers into the palace, make away with the king, secure the princess, and announce the sudden death of his Majesty, read as his the will they had drawn up, and proceed to govern the country at their ease, and with results. They would at once levy severer taxes, and pick a quarrel with the most powerful of their neighbours. Everything settled, they agreed to retire and have a few hours' quiet sleep first, all but the secretary, who was to sit up and call them at the proper moment. Curdie stole away, allowed them half an hour to get to bed, and then set about completing his purgation of the palace. First he called Lena, and opened the door of the room where the secretary sat. She crept in, and laid herself down against it. When the secretary, rising to stretch his legs, caught sight of her eyes, he stood frozen with terror. She made neither motion nor sound. Gathering courage, and taking the thing for a spectral illusion, He made a step forward. She showed her other teeth, with a growl neither more than audible nor less than horrible. The secretary sank fainting into a chair. He was not a brave man, and besides, his conscience had gone over to the enemy, and was sitting against the door by Lena. To the Lord Chamberlain's door next, Curdie conducted the Lake Serpent, and let him in. Now his lordship had had a bedstead made for himself, sweetly fashioned of rods of silver gilt. Upon it the Lake Serpent found him asleep, and under it he crept. But out he came on the other side, and crept over it next, and again under it, and so over it, under it, over it, 5 or 6 times, every time leaving a coil of himself behind him, until he had softly folded all his length about the Lord Chamberlain and his bed. This done, he set up his head, looking down with curved neck right over his lordship's, and began to hiss in his face. He woke in terror unspeakable, and would have started up, but the moment he moved, the Lake Serpent drew his coils closer and closer still, and drew until the quaking trader heard the joints of his bedstead grinding and gnawing. Presently he persuaded himself that it was only a horrid nightmare, and began to struggle with all his strength to throw it off. Thereupon the Lake Serpent gave his hooked nose such a bite that his teeth met through it, but it was hardly thicker than the bowl of a spoon, and then the vulture knew that he was in the grasp of his enemy, the snake, and yielded. As soon as he was quiet, the Lake Serpent began to untwist and retwist, to uncoil and recoil himself, swinging and swaying, knotting and relaxing himself with strangest curves and convolutions, always, however, leaving at least one coil around his victim. At last he undid himself entirely, and crept from the bed. Then first the Lord Chamberlain discovered that his tormentor had bent and twisted the bedstead, legs and canopy and all, so about him, that he was shut in a silver cage, out of which it was impossible for him to find a way. Once more, thinking his enemy was gone, he began to shout for help, but the instant he opened his mouth, his keeper darted at him and bit him, and after 3 or 4 such essays, with like result, he lay still. The master of the horse Curdie gave in charge to the taper. When the soldier saw him enter, for he was not yet asleep, he sprang from his bed and flew at him with his sword. But the creature's hide was invulnerable to his blows, and he pecked at his legs with his proboscis until he jumped into bed again, groaning, and covered himself up. After which the taper contented himself with now and then paying a visit to his toes. For the Attorney General, Curdie led to his door a huge spider, about 2 feet long in the body, which, having made an excellent supper, was full of webbing. The Attorney General had not gone to bed, but sat in a chair asleep before a great mirror. He had been trying the effect of a diamond star which he had that morning taken from the jewel room. When he woke, he fancied himself paralyzed. Every limb, every finger even, was motionless. Coils and coils of broad spider ribbon bandaged his members to his body, and all to the chair. In the glass he saw himself wound about, under and over and around, with slavery infinite. And on a footstool a yard off sat the spider, glaring at him. Clubhead had mounted guard over the butler, where he lay tied hand and foot under the 3rd cask. From that cask he had seen the wine run into a great bath, and therein he expected to be drowned. The doctor, with his crushed leg, needed no one to guard him. And now Curdie proceeded to the expulsion of the rest. Great men or underlings, he treated them all alike. From room to room over the house he went, and sleeping or waking, took the man by the hand. Such was the state to which a year of wicked rule had reduced the moral condition of the court, that in it all he found but 3 with human hands. The possessors of these he allowed to dress themselves and depart in peace. When they perceived his mission, and how he was backed, they yielded without dispute. Then commenced a general hunt to clear the house of the vermin. Out of their beds and their night clothing, out of their rooms, gorgeous chambers, or garret nooks, the creatures hunted them. Not one was allowed to escape. Tumult and noise there was little, for the fear was too deadly for outcry. Ferreting them out everywhere, following them upstairs and downstairs, yielding no instant of repose except upon the way out, the avengers persecuted the miscreants, until the last of them was shivering outside the palace gates, with hardly sense enough left to know where to turn. When they set out to look for shelter, they found every inn full of the servants expelled before them, and not one would yield his place to a superior suddenly levelled with himself. Most houses refused to admit them on the ground of the wickedness that must have drawn on them such a punishment, and not a few would have been left in the streets all night, had not Durba, roused by the vain entreaties at the doors on each side of her cottage, opened hers, and given up everything to them. The Lord Chancellor was only too glad to share a mattress with a stable boy, and steal his bare feet under his jacket. In the morning Curdie appeared, and the outcasts were in terror, thinking he had come after them again. But he took no notice of them. His object was to request Durba to go to the palace. The king required her services. She needed take no trouble about her cottage, he said. The palace was henceforward her home. She was the king's chatelaine over men and maidens of his household, and this very morning she must cook his majesty a nice breakfast. Various reports went undulating through the city as to the nature of what had taken place in the palace. The people gathered and stared at the house, eyeing it as if it had sprung up in the night, but it looked sedate enough, remaining closed and silent, like a house that was dead. They saw no one come out or go in. Smoke rose from a chimney or two. There was hardly another sign of life. It was not for some little time generally understood that the highest officers of the crown, as well as the lowest menials of the palace, had been dismissed in disgrace. For who was to recognize a Lord Chancellor in his nightshirt? And what Lord Chancellor would, so attired in the street, proclaim his rank and office aloud? Before it was day, most of the courtiers crept down to the river, hired boats, and betook themselves to their homes or their friends in the country. It was assumed in the city that the domestics had been discharged upon a sudden discovery of general and unpardonable peculation, for, almost everybody being guilty of it himself, petty dishonesty was the crime most easily credited and least easily passed over in Gwyntystorm. Now that same day was Religion Day, and not a few of the clergy, always glad to seize on any passing event to give interest to the dull and monotonic grind of their intellectual machines, made this remarkable one the ground of discourse to their congregations. More especially than the rest, the first priest of the great temple, where was the royal pew, judged himself, from his relation to the palace, called upon to improve the occasion, for they talked ever about improvement at Gwyntystorm, all the time they were going downhill with a rush. The book which had, of late years, come to be considered the most sacred, was called the Book of Nations, and consisted of proverbs and history traced through custom. From it the first priest chose his text, and his text was, "Honesty is the best policy." He was considered a very eloquent man, but I can offer only a few of the larger bones of his sermon. The main proof of the verity of their religion, he said, was, that things always went well with those who professed it, and its first fundamental principle, grounded in inborn invariable instinct, was that every one should take care of that one. This was the first duty of man. If every one would but obey this law, number one, then would every one be perfectly cared for, one being always equal to one. But the faculty of care was in excess of need, and all that overflowed, and would otherwise run to waste, ought to be gently turned in the direction of one's neighbour, seeing that this also wrought for the fulfilling of the law, inasmuch as the reaction of excess so directed was upon the director of the same, to the comfort, that is, and well-being of the original self. To be just and friendly was to build the warmest and safest of all nests, and to be kind and loving was to line it with the softest of all furs and feathers, for the one precious, comfort-loving self there to lie, revelling in downiest bliss. One of the laws, therefore, most binding upon men, because of its relation to the first and greatest of all duties, was embodied in the proverb he had just read. And what stronger proof of its wisdom and truth could they desire than the sudden and complete vengeance which had fallen upon those worse than ordinary sinners who had offended against the king's majesty by forgetting that honesty is the best policy? At this point of the discourse, the head of the Lake Serpent rose from the floor of the temple, towering above the pulpit, above the priest, then curving downwards, with open mouth slowly descended upon him. Horror froze the sermon pump. He stared upwards, aghast. The great teeth of the animal closed upon a mouthful of the sacred vestments, and slowly he lifted the preacher from the pulpit, like a handful of linen from a wash-tub, and, on his 4 solemn stumps, bore him out of the temple, dangling aloft from his jaws. At the back of it he dropped him into the dust-hole among the remnants of a library whose age had destroyed its value in the eyes of the chapter. They found him burrowing in it, a lunatic henceforth, whose madness presented the peculiar feature that in its paroxysms he jabbered sense. Bone-freezing horror pervaded Gwynstorm. If their best and wisest were treated with such contempt, what might not the rest of them look for? Alas for their city, their grandly respectable city, their loftily reasonable city! Where it was all to end, the convenient alone could tell. But something must be done. Hastily assembling, the priests chose a new first priest, and in full conclave unanimously declared and accepted that the king, in his retirement, had, through the practice of the blackest magic, turned the palace into a nest of demons in the midst of them. A grand exorcism was therefore indispensable. In the meantime, the fact came out that the greater part of the courtiers had been dismissed, as well as the servants, and this fact swelled the hope of the party of decency, as they called themselves. Upon it they proceeded to act, and strengthened themselves on all sides. The action of the king's bodyguard remained for a time uncertain, but when at length its officers were satisfied that both the master of the horse and their colonel were missing, they placed themselves under the orders of the first priest. Everyone dated the culmination of the evil from the visit of the miner and his mongrel, and the butchers vowed, if they could but get hold of them again, they would roast both of them alive. At once they formed themselves into a regiment, and put their dogs in training for attack. Incessant was the talk, innumerable were the suggestions, and great was the deliberation. The general consent, however, was that as soon as the priests should have expelled the demons, they would depose the king, and, attired in all his regal insignia, shut him in a cage for public show, then choose governors, with the Lord Chancellor at their head, whose first duty should be to remit every possible tax, and the magistrates, by the mouth of the city marshal, required all able-bodied citizens, in order to do their part towards the carrying out of these and a multitude of other reforms, to be ready to take arms at the first summons. Things needful were prepared as speedily as possible, and a mighty ceremony in the temple, in the marketplace, and in front of the palace, was performed for the expulsion of the demons. This over, the leaders retired to arrange an attack upon the palace. But that night events occurred which, proving the failure of their first, induced the abandonment of their second intent. Certain of the prowling order of the community, whose numbers had of late been steadily on the increase, reported frightful things. Demons of indescribable ugliness had been espied careering through the midnight streets and courts. A citizen, some said in the very act of housebreaking, but no one cared to look into trifles at such a crisis, had been seized from behind, he could not see by what, and soused in the river. A well-known receiver of stolen goods had had his shop broken open, and when he came down in the morning had found everything in ruin on the pavement. The wooden image of justice over the door of the city marshal had had the arm that had the sword bitten off. The gluttonous magistrate had been pulled from his bed in the dark, by beings of which he could see nothing but the flaming eyes, and treated to a bath of the turtle soup that had been left simmering by the side of the kitchen fire. Having poured it over him, they put him again into his bed, where he soon learned how a mummy must feel in its cerements. Worst of all, in the market-place was fixed up a paper with the king's own signature, to the effect that whoever henceforth should show inhospitality to strangers, and should be convicted of the same, should be instantly expelled the city, while a second, in the butcher's quarter, ordained that any dog which henceforward should attack a stranger should be immediately destroyed. It was plain, said the butchers, that the clergy were of no use. They could not exorcise demons. That afternoon, catching sight of a poor old fellow in rags and tatters, quietly walking up the street, they hounded their dogs upon him, and had it not been that the door of Durba's cottage was standing open, and was near enough for him to dart in and shut it ere they reached him, he would have been torn in pieces. And thus things went on for some days. In the meantime, with Durba to minister to his wants, with Curdie to protect him, and Irene to nurse him, the king was getting rapidly stronger. Good food was what he most wanted, and of that, at least of certain kinds of it, there was plentiful store in the palace. Everywhere since the cleansing of the lower regions of it, the air was clean and sweet, and under the honest hands of the one housemaid, the king's chamber became a pleasure to his eyes. With such changes, it was no wonder if his heart grew lighter, as well as his brain clearer. But still, evil dreams came and troubled him, the lingering result of the wicked medicines the doctor had given him. Every night, sometimes twice or thrice, he would wake up in terror, and it would be minutes ere he could come to himself. The consequence was that he was always worse in the morning, and had loss to make up during the day. This retarded his recovery greatly. While he slept, Irene or Curdie, one or the other, must still be always by his side. One night, when it was Curdie's turn with the king, he heard a cry somewhere in the house, and as there was no other child, concluded, notwithstanding the distance of her grandmother's room, that it must be Barbara. Fearing something might be wrong, and noting the king's sleep more quiet than usual, he ran to see. He found the child in the middle of the floor, weeping bitterly, and Durba slumbering peacefully in bed. The instant she saw him, the night-lost thing ceased her crying, smiled, and stretched out her arms to him. Unwilling to wake the old woman, who had been working hard all day, he took the child and carried her with him. She clung to him so, pressing her tear-wet, radiant face against his, that her little arms threatened to choke him. When he re-entered the chamber, he found the king sitting up in bed, fighting the phantoms of some hideous dream. Generally upon such occasions, although he saw his watcher, he could not dissociate him from the dream, and went raving on. But the moment his eyes fell upon little Barbara, whom he had never seen before, his soul came into them with a rush, and a smile like the dawn of an eternal day overspread his countenance. The dream was nowhere, and the child was in his heart. He stretched out his arms to her, the child stretched out hers to him, and in 5 minutes they were both asleep, each in the other's embrace. From that night, Barbara had a crib in the king's chamber, and as often as he woke, Irene or Curdie, whichever was watching, took the sleeping child and laid her in his arms, upon which, invariably and instantly, the dream would vanish. A great part of the day, too, she would be playing on or about the king's bed, and it was a delight to the heart of the princess to see her amusing herself with the crown, now sitting upon it, now rolling it hither and thither about the room like a hoop. Her grandmother, entering once while she was pretending to make porridge in it, held up her hands in horror-struck amazement, but the king would not allow her to interfere, for the king was now Barbara's playmate, and his crown their plaything. The colonel of the guard was also growing better. Curdie went often to see him. They were soon friends, for the best people understand each other the easiest, and the grim old warrior loved the miner boy as if he were at once his son and his angel. He was very anxious about his regiment. He said the officers were mostly honest men, he believed, but how they might be doing without him, or what they might resolve, in ignorance of the real state of affairs, and exposed to every misrepresentation, who could tell? Curdie proposed that he should send for the major, offering to be the messenger. The colonel agreed, and Curdie went, not without his mattock, because of the dogs. But the officers had been told by the master of the horse that their colonel was dead, and although they were amazed he should be buried without the attendance of his regiment, they never doubted the information. The handwriting itself of their colonel was insufficient, counteracted by the fresh reports daily current, to destroy the lie. The major regarded the letter as a trap for the next officer in command, and sent his orderly to arrest the messenger. But Curdie had had the wisdom not to wait for an answer. The king's enemies said that he had first poisoned the good colonel of the guard, and then murdered the master of the horse, and other faithful counsellors, and that his oldest and most attached domestics had but escaped from the palace with their lives, nor all of them, for the butler was missing. Mad or wicked, he was not only unfit to rule any longer, but worse than unfit to have in his power and under his influence the young princess, only hope of Gwynstorm and the kingdom. The moment the Lord Chancellor reached his house in the country, and had got himself clothed, he began to devise how yet to destroy his master, and the very next morning set out for the neighbouring kingdom of Borsagrass, to invite invasion, and offer a compact with its monarch. At the cottage on the mountain, everything for a time went on just as before. It was indeed dull without Curdie, but as often as they looked at the emerald, it was gloriously green, and with nothing to fear or regret, and everything to hope, they required little comforting. One morning, however, at last, Peter, who had been consulting the gem, rather now from habit than anxiety, as a farmer his barometer in undoubtful weather, turned suddenly to his wife, the stone in his hand, and held it up with a look of ghastly dismay. "Why, that's never the emerald," said Joan. "It is," answered Peter, "but it were small blame to any one that took it for a bit of bottle glass." For, all save one spot right in the centre, of intensest and most brilliant green, it looked as if the colour had been burnt out of it. "Run, run, Peter!" cried his wife. "Run and tell the old princess. It may not be too late. The boy must be lying at death's door." Without a word, Peter caught up his mattock, darted from the cottage, and was at the bottom of the hill in less time than he usually took to get halfway. The door of the king's house stood open. He rushed in and up the stair, but after wandering about in vain for an hour, opening door after door, and finding no way farther up, the heart of the old man had well nigh failed him. Empty rooms, desertion and desolation everywhere. At last he did come upon the door to the tower stair. Up he darted. Arrived at the top, he found 3 doors, and, one after the other, knocked at them all. But there was neither voice nor hearing. Urged by his faith and his dread, slowly, hesitatingly, he opened one. It revealed a bare garret room, nothing in it but 1 chair and 1 spinning wheel. He closed it, and opened the next, to start back in terror, for he saw nothing but a great gulf, a moonless night, full of stars, and, for all the stars, dark, a fathomless abyss. He opened the 3rd door, and a rush like the tide of a living sea invaded his ears. Multitudinous wings flapped and flashed in the sun, and, like the ascending column from a volcano, white birds innumerable shot into the air, darkening the sky with the shadow of their cloud, and then, with a sharp sweep, as if bent sideways by a sudden wind, flew northward, swiftly away, and vanished. The place felt like a tomb. There seemed no breath of life left in it. Despair laid hold upon him. He rushed down, thundering with heavy feet. Out upon him darted the housekeeper like an ogress spider, and after her came her men, but Peter rushed past them, heedless and careless, for had not the princess mocked him, and sped along the road to Gwynstorm. What help lay in a miner's mattock, a man's arm, a father's heart, he would bear to his boy. Joan sat up all night waiting his return, hoping and hoping. The mountain was very still, and the sky was clear. But all night long the miner sped northwards, and the heart of his wife was troubled. Things in the palace were in a strange condition. The king playing with a child and dreaming wise dreams, waited upon by a little princess with the heart of a queen, and a youth from the mines who went nowhere, not even into the king's chamber, without his mattock on his shoulder and a horrible animal at his heels. In a room near by, the colonel of his guard, also in bed, without a soldier to obey him. In 6 other rooms, far apart, 6 miscreants, each watched by a beast jailer, ministers to them all, an old woman, a young woman, and a page. And in the wine cellar, 43 animals, creatures more grotesque than ever brain of man invented. None dared approach its gates, and seldom one issued from them. All the dwellers in the city were united in enmity to the palace. It swarmed with evil spirits, they said, whereas the evil spirits were in the city, unsuspected. One consequence of their presence was that, when the rumour came that a great army was on the march against Gwynstorm, instead of rushing to their defences to make new gates, free portcullises and drawbridges, and bar the river, each and all flew first to their treasures, burying them in their cellars and gardens, and hiding them behind stones in their chimneys, and next to rebellion, signing an invitation to his majesty of Borsagrass to enter at their open gates, destroy their king, and annex their country to his own. The straits of isolation were soon found in the palace. Its invalids were requiring stronger food, and what was to be done? For if the butcher sent meat to the palace, was it not likely enough to be poisoned? Curdie said to Durba he would think of some plan before morning. But that same night, as soon as it was dark, Lena came to her master, and let him understand she wanted to go out. He unlocked a little private postern for her, left it so that she could push it open when she returned, and told the crocodile to stretch himself across it inside. Before midnight she came back with a young deer. Early the next morning the Lake Serpent crept out of the wine cellar, through the broken door behind, shot into the river, and soon appeared in the kitchen with a splendid sturgeon. Every night Lena went out hunting, and every morning Lake Serpent went out fishing, and both invalids and household had plenty to eat. As to news, the page in plain clothes would now and then venture out into the marketplace and gather some. One night he came back with the report that the army of the king of Borsagrass had crossed the border. 2 days after, he brought the news that the enemy was now but 20 miles from Gwynstorm. The colonel of the guard rose and began furbishing his armour, but gave it over to the page, and staggered across to the barracks, which were in the next street. The sentry took him for a ghost, or worse, ran into the guard-room, bolted the door, and stopped his ears. The poor colonel, who was yet hardly able to stand, crawled back despairing. For Curdie he had already, as soon as the first rumour reached him, resolved, if no other instructions came, and the king continued unable to give orders, to call Lena and the creatures, and march to meet the enemy. If he died for the right, and there was a right end of it. He had no preparations to make, except a good sleep. He asked the king to let the housemaid take his place by his majesty that night, and went and lay down on the floor of the corridor, no farther off than a whisper would reach from the door of the chamber. There, with an old mantle of the king's thrown over him, he was soon fast asleep. Somewhere about the middle of the night, he woke suddenly, started to his feet, and rubbed his eyes. He could not tell what had waked him. But could he be awake, or was he not dreaming? The curtain of the king's door, a dull red ever before, was glowing, a gorgeous, a radiant purple, and the crown wrought upon it in silks and gems was flashing as if it burned. What could it mean? Was the king's chamber on fire? He darted to the door and lifted the curtain. Glorious, terrible sight! A long and broad marble table that stood at one end of the room had been drawn into the middle of it, and thereon burned a great fire of a sort that Curdie knew, a fire of glowing, flaming roses, red and white. In the midst of the roses lay the king, moaning but motionless. Every rose that fell from the table to the floor, someone, whom Curdie could not plainly see for the brightness, lifted and laid burning upon the king's face, until at length his face too was covered with the live roses, and he lay all within the fire, moaning still, with now and then a shuddering sob. And the shape that Curdie saw and could not see, wept over the king as he lay in the fire, and often she hid her face in handfuls of her shadowy hair, and from her hair the water of her weeping dropped like sunset rain in the light of the roses. At last she lifted a great armful of her hair and shook it over the fire, and the drops fell from it in showers, and they did not hiss in the flames, but there arose instead, as it were, the sound of running brooks, and the glow of the red fire died away, and the glow of the white fire grew grey, and the light was gone, and on the table all was black, except the face of the king, which shone from under the burnt roses like a diamond in the ashes of a furnace. Then Curdie, no longer dazzled, saw and knew the old princess. The room was lighted with the splendor of her face, of her blue eyes, of her sapphire crown. Her golden hair went streaming out from her through the air till it went off in mist and light. She was large and strong as a Titaness. She stooped over the table altar, put her mighty arms under the living sacrifice, lifted the king as if he were but a little child to her bosom, walked with him up the floor, and laid him in his bed. Then darkness fell. The miner boy turned silent away, and laid himself down again in the corridor. An absolute joy filled his heart, his bosom, his head, his whole body. All was safe, all was well. With the helve of his mattock tight in his grasp, he sank into a dreamless sleep. He woke like a giant refreshed with wine. When he went into the king's chamber, the housemaid sat where he had left her, and everything in the room was as it had been the night before, save that a heavenly odor of roses filled the air of it. He went up to the bed. The king opened his eyes, and the soul of perfect health shone out of them. Nor was Curdie amazed in his delight. "Is it not time to rise, Curdie?" said the king. "It is, your majesty. Today we must be doing." "What must we be doing today, Curdie?" "Fighting, sire." "Then fetch me my armor, that of plated steel in the chest there. You will find the underclothing with it." As he spoke, he reached out his hand for his sword, which hung in the bed before him, drew it, and examined the blade. "A little rusty," he said, "but the edge is there. We shall polish it ourselves today, not on the wheel. Curdie, my son, I wake from a troubled dream. A glorious torture has ended it, and I live. I know not well how things are, but thou shalt explain them to me as I get on my armor. No, I need no bath. I am clean. Call the colonel of the guard." In complete steel the old man stepped into the chamber. He knew it not, but the old princess had passed through his room in the night. "Why, Sir Bronzebeard," said the king, "you are dressed before me. Thou needest no valet, old man, when there is battle in the wind." "Battle, sire?" returned the colonel. "Where then are our soldiers?" "Why, there and here," answered the king, pointing to the colonel first, and then to himself. "Where else, man? The enemy will be upon us ere sunset, if we be not upon him ere noon. What other thing was in thy brave brain when thou didst don thine armor, friend?" "Your majesty's orders, sire," answered Sir Bronzebeard. The king smiled and turned to Curdie. "And what was in thine, Curdie? For thy first word was of battle." "See, your majesty," answered Curdie, "I have polished my mattock. If your majesty had not taken the command, I would have met the enemy at the head of my beasts, and died in comfort, or done better." "Brave boy," said the king. "He who takes his life in his hand is the only soldier. Thou shalt head thy beasts to-day. Sir Bronzebeard, wilt thou die with me, if need be?" "7 times, my king," said the colonel. "Then shall we win this battle," said the king. "Curdie, go and bind securely the 6, that we lose not their guards. Canst thou find a horse, thinkest thou, Sir Bronzebeard? Alas, they told us our white charger was dead." "I will go and fright the varletry with my presence, and secure, I trust, a horse for your majesty, and one for myself." "And look you, brother," said the king, "bring one for my miner boy too, and a sober old charger for the princess, for she too must go to the battle and conquer with us." "Pardon me, sire," said Curdie, "a miner can fight best on foot. I might smite my horse dead under me with a missed blow, and besides, I must be near my beasts." "As you will," said the king. 3 horses then, Sir Bronzebeard." The colonel departed, doubting sorely in his heart how to accoutre and lead from the barrack stables 3 horses in the teeth of his revolted regiment. In the hall he met the housemaid. "Can you lead a horse?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Are you willing to die for the king?" "Yes, sir." "Can you do as you are bid?" "I can keep on trying, sir." "Come then. Were I not a man, I would be a woman such as thou." When they entered the barrack yard, the soldiers scattered like autumn leaves before a blast of winter. They went into the stable unchallenged, and lo, in the stall, before the colonel's eyes, stood the king's white charger, with the royal saddle and bridle hung high beside him. "Traitorous thieves!" muttered the old man in his beard, and went along the stalls, looking for his own black charger. Having found him, he returned to saddle first the king's, but the maid had already the saddle upon him, and so girt that the colonel could thrust no finger-tip between girth and skin. He left her to finish what she had so well begun, and went and graithed his own. He then chose for the princess a great red horse, 20 years old, which he knew to possess every equine virtue. This and his own he led to the palace, and the maid led the king's. The king and Curdie stood in the court, the king in full armour of silvered steel, with a circlet of rubies and diamonds round his helmet. He almost leaped for joy when he saw his great white charger come in, gentle as a child, to the hand of the housemaid. But when the horse saw his master in his armour, he reared and bounded in jubilation, yet did not break from the hand that held him. Then out came the princess attired and ready, with a hunting knife her father had given her by her side. They brought her mother's saddle, splendent with gems and gold, set it on the great red horse, and lifted her to it. But the saddle was so big, and the horse so tall, that the child found no comfort in them. "Please, King Papa," she said, "can I not have my white pony?" "I did not think of him, little one," said the king. "Where is he?" "In the stable," answered the maid. "I found him half starved, the only horse within the gates, the day after the servants were driven out. He has been well fed since." "Go and fetch him," said the king. As the maid appeared with the pony, from a side door came Lena and the 49, following Curdie. "I will go with Curdie and the Uglies," cried the princess, and as soon as she was mounted, she got into the middle of the pack. So out they set, the strangest force that ever went against an enemy. The king in silver armour sat stately on his white steed, with the stones flashing on his helmet. Beside him the grim old colonel, armed in steel, rode his black charger. Behind the king, a little to the right, Curdie walked afoot, his mattock shining in the sun. Lena followed at his heel. Behind her came the wonderful company of Uglies. In the midst of them rose the gracious little Irene, dressed in blue, and mounted on the prettiest of white ponies. Behind the colonel, a little to the left, walked the page, armed in a breastplate, headpiece, and trooper's sword he had found in the palace, all much too big for him, and carrying a huge brass trumpet, which he did his best to blow. And the king smiled, and seemed pleased with his music, although it was but the grunt of a brazen unrest. Alongside of the beasts walked Derba carrying Barbara, their refuge the mountains, should the cause of the king be lost. As soon as they were over the river, they turned aside to ascend the cliff, and there awaited the forging of the day's history. Then first, Curdie saw that the housemaid, whom they had all forgotten, was following, mounted on the great red horse, and seated in the royal saddle. Many were the eyes unfriendly of women that had stared at them from door and window as they passed through the city, and low laughter and mockery and evil words from the lips of children had rippled about their ears. But the men were all gone to welcome the enemy, the butchers first, the king's guard the last. And now on the heels of the king's army rushed out the women and children also, to gather flowers and branches, wherewith to welcome their conquerors. About a mile down the river, Curdie, happening to look behind him, saw the maid, whom he had supposed gone with Derba, still following on the great red horse. The same moment the king, a few paces in front of him, caught sight of the enemy's tents, pitched where, the cliffs receding, the bank of the river widened to a little plain. He commanded the page to blow his trumpet, and, in the strength of the moment, the youth uttered a right warlike defiance. But the butchers and the guard, who had gone over armed to the enemy, thinking that the king had come to make his peace also, and that it might thereafter go hard with them, rushed at once to make short work with him, and both secure and commend themselves. The butchers came on first, for the guards had slackened their saddle girths, brandishing their knives and talking to their dogs. Curdie and the page, with Lena and her pack, bounded to meet them. Curdie struck down the foremost with his mattock. The page, finding his sword too much for him, threw it away and seized the butcher's knife, which, as he rose, he plunged into the foremost dog. Lena rushed raging and gnashing amongst them. She would not look at a dog so long as there was a butcher on his legs, and she never stopped to kill a butcher, only with one grind of her jaws crushed a leg of him. When they were all down, then indeed she flashed amongst the dogs. Meantime the king and the colonel had spurred towards the advancing guard. The king clove the major through skull and collarbone, and the colonel stabbed the captain in the throat. Then a fierce combat commenced, 2 against many. But the butchers and their dogs quickly disposed of, up came Curdie and his beasts. The horses of the guard, struck with terror, turned in spite of the spur, and fled in confusion. Thereupon the forces of Borsagrass, which could see little of the affair, but correctly imagined a small, determined body in front of them, hastened to the attack. No sooner did their first advancing wave appear through the foam of the retreating one, than the king and the colonel and the page, Curdie and the beasts, went charging upon them. Their attack, especially the rush of the uglies, threw the first line into great confusion, but the second came up quickly. The beasts could not be everywhere. There were thousands to one against them, and the king and his 3 companions were in the greatest possible danger. A dense cloud came over the sun, and sank rapidly towards the earth. The cloud moved all together, and yet the thousands of white flakes of which it was made up moved each for itself in ceaseless and rapid motion. Those flakes were the wings of pigeons. Down swooped the birds upon the invaders. Right in the face of a man and horse they flew with swift beating wings, blinding eyes and confounding brain. Horses reared and plunged and wheeled. All was at once in confusion. The men made frantic efforts to seize their tormentors, but not one could they touch, and they outdoubled them in numbers. Between every wild clutch came a peck of beak and a buffet of pinion in the face. Generally the bird would, with sharp clapping wings, dart its whole body, with the swiftness of an arrow, against its singled mark, yet so as to glance aloft the same instant, and descend skimming, much as the thin stone shot with a horizontal cast of arm, having touched and torn the surface of the lake, ascends to skim, touch, and tear again. So mingled the feathered multitude in the grim game of war. It was a storm in which the wind was birds and the sea men. and ever as each bird arrived at the rear of the enemy, it turned, ascended, and sped to the front to charge again. The moment the battle began, the princess's pony took fright and turned and fled, but the maid wheeled her horse across the road and stopped him, and they waited together the result of the battle. And as they waited, it seemed to the princess right strange that the pigeons, every one as it came to the rear, and fetched a compass to gather force for the re-attack, should make the head of her attendant on the red horse the goal around which it turned, so that about them was an unintermittent flapping and flashing of wings, and a curving, sweeping torrent of the side-poised, wheeling bodies of birds. Strange also, it seemed, that the maid should be constantly waving her arm towards the battle, and the time of the motion of her arm so fitted with the rushes of birds, that it looked as if the birds obeyed her gesture, and she were casting living javelins by the thousand upon the enemy. The moment a pigeon had rounded her head, it went off straight as bolt from bow, and with trebled velocity. But of these strange things, others besides the princess had taken note. From a rising ground whence they watched the battle in growing dismay, the leaders of the army saw the maid and her motions, and concluding her an enchantress, whose were the airy legions humiliating them, set spurs to their horses, made a circuit, outflanked the king, and came down upon her. But suddenly by her side stood a stalwart old man in the garb of a miner, who, as the general rode at her, sword in hand, heaved his swift mattock, and brought it down with such force on the forehead of his charger that he fell to the ground like a log. His rider shot over his head and lay stunned. Had not the great red horse reared and wheeled, he would have fallen beneath that of the general. With lifted saber, one of his attendant officers rode at the miner, but a mass of pigeons darted in the faces of him and his horse, and the next moment he lay beside his commander. The rest of them turned and fled, pursued by the birds. "Ah, friend Peter," said the maid, "thou hast come as I told thee. Welcome and thanks." By this time the battle was over. The rout was general. The enemy stormed back upon their own camp, with the beasts roaring in the midst of them, and the king and his army, now reinforced by one, pursuing. But presently the king drew rein. "Call off your hounds, Curdie, and let the pigeons do the rest," he shouted, and turned to see what had become of the princess. In full panic fled the invaders, sweeping down their tents, stumbling over their baggage, trampling on their dead and wounded, ceaselessly pursued and buffeted by the white-winged army of heaven. Homeward they rushed the road they had come, straight for the borders, many dropping from pure fatigue and lying where they fell. And still the pigeons were in their necks as they ran. At length, to the eyes of the king and his army, nothing was visible save a dust cloud below and a bird cloud above. Before night the bird cloud came back, flying high over Gwynstorm. Sinking swiftly, it disappeared among the ancient roofs of the palace. The king and his army returned, bringing with them one prisoner only, the Lord Chancellor. Curdie had dragged him from under a fallen tent, not by the hand of a man, but by the foot of a mule. When they entered the city, it was still as the grave. The citizens had fled home. "We must submit," they cried, "or the king and his demons will destroy us." The king rode through the streets in silence, ill pleased with his people. But he stopped his horse in the midst of the market-place, and called, in a voice loud and clear as the cry of a silver trumpet, "Go and find your own. Bury your dead, and bring home your wounded." Then he turned him gloomily to the palace. Just as they reached the gates, Peter, who as they went had been telling his tale to Curdie, ended it with the words, "And so there I was, in the nick of time to save the two princesses." "The two princesses, father? The one on the great red horse was the housemaid," said Curdie, and ran to open the gates for the king. They found Durba returned before them, and already busy preparing them food. The king put up his charger with his own hands, rubbed him down, and fed him. When they had washed and eaten and drunk, he called the colonel and told Curdie and the page to bring out the traders and the beasts, and attend him to the market-place. By this time the people were crowding back into the city, bearing their dead and wounded, and there was lamentation in Gwynstorm, for no one could comfort himself, and no one had any to comfort him. The nation was victorious, but the people were conquered. The king stood in the centre of the market-place, upon the steps of the ancient cross. He had laid aside his helmet and put on his crown, but he stood all armed beside, with his sword in his hand. He called the people to him, and for all the terror of the beasts, they dared not disobey him. Those even who were carrying their wounded laid them down, and drew near, trembling. Then the king said to Curdie and the page, "Set the evil men before me." He looked upon them for a moment in mingled anger and pity, then turned to the people and said, "Behold your trust. Ye slaves, behold your leaders. I would have freed you, but ye would not be free. Now ye shall be ruled with a rod of iron, that ye may learn what freedom is, and love it and seek it. These wretches I will send where they shall mislead you no longer." He made a sign to Curdie, who immediately brought up the Lake Serpent. To the body of the animal they bound the Lord Chamberlain, speechless with horror. The butler began to shriek and pray, but they bound him on the back of Clubhead. One after another, upon the largest of the creatures, they bound the whole 7, each through the unveiling terror looking the villain he was. Then said the king, "I thank you, my good beasts, and I hope to visit you ere long. Take these evil men with you, and go to your place." Like a whirlwind they were in the crowd, scattering it like dust. Like hounds they rushed from the city, their burdens howling and raving. What became of them, I have never heard. Then the king turned once more to the people and said, "Go to your houses," nor vouchsafed them another word. They crept home like chidden hounds. The king returned to the palace. He made the colonel a duke, and the page a knight, and Peter he appointed general of all his mines. But to Curdie he said, "You are my own boy, Curdie. My child cannot choose but love you, and when you are both grown up, if you both will, you shall marry each other, and be king and queen when I am gone. Till then, be the king's Curdie." Irene held out her arms to Curdie. He raised her in his, and she kissed him. "And my Curdie too," she said. Thereafter the people called him Prince Conrad, but the king always called him either just Curdie or my minor boy. They sat down to supper, and Durba and the knight and the housemaid waited, and Barbara sat on the king's left hand. The housemaid poured out the wine, and as she poured out for Curdie red wine that foamed in the cup, as if glad to see the light whence it had been banished so long, she looked him in the eyes. And Curdie started, and sprang from his seat, and dropped on his knees, and burst into tears. And the maid said with a smile, such as none but one could smile, "Did I not tell you, Curdie, that it might be you would not know me when next you saw me?" Then she went from the room, and in a moment returned in royal purple, with a crown of diamonds and rubies, from under which her hair went flowing to the floor, all about her ruby-slippered feet. Her face was radiant with joy, the joy overshadowed by a faint mist as of unfulfillment. The king rose and kneeled on one knee before her. All kneeled in like homage. Then the king would have yielded her his royal chair, but she made them all sit down, and with her own hands placed at the table seats for Durba and the page. Then in ruby crown and royal purple she served them all. The king sent Curdie out into his dominions to search for men and women that had human hands, and many such he found, honest and true, and brought them to his master. So a new and upright government, a new and upright court was formed, and strength returned to the nation. But the exchequer was almost empty, for the evil men had squandered everything, and the king hated taxes unwillingly paid. Then came Curdie and said to the king that the city stood upon gold, and the king sent for men wise in the ways of the earth, and they built smelting furnaces, and Peter brought miners, and they mined the gold, and smelted it, and the king coined it into money, and therewith established things well in the land. The same day on which he found his boy, Peter set out to go home. When he told the good news to Joan his wife, she rose from her chair and said, "Let us go." And they left the cottage and repaired to Gwynstorm. And on a mountain above the city they built themselves a warm house for their old age, high in the clear air. As Peter mined one day by himself at the back of the king's wine cellar, he broke into a cavern all crusted with gems, and much wealth flowed therefrom, and the king used it wisely. Queen Irene, that was the right name of the old princess, was thereafter seldom long absent from the palace. Once or twice when she was missing, Barbara, who seemed to know of her sometimes when nobody else had a notion whither she had gone, said she was with the dear old Uglies in the wood. Curdie thought that perhaps her business might be with others there as well. All the uppermost rooms in the palace were left to her use, and when anyone was in need of her help, up thither he must go. But even when she was there, he did not always succeed in finding her. She, however, always knew that such a one had been looking for her. Curdie went to find her one day, and as he ascended the last stair, to meet him came the well-known scent of her roses, and when he opened her door, lo, there was the same gorgeous room in which his touch had been glorified by her fire. And there burned the fire, a huge heap of red and white roses. Before the hearth stood the princess, an old grey-haired woman, with Lena a little behind her, slowly wagging her tail, and looking like a beast of prey that can hardly so long restrain itself from springing as to be sure of its victim. The queen was casting roses, more and more roses, upon the fire. At last she turned and said, "Now, Lena." And Lena dashed burrowing into the fire. There went up a black smoke and a dust, and Lena was never more seen in the palace. Irene and Curdie were married. The old king died, and they were king and queen. As long as they lived, Gwynstorm was a better city, and good people grew in it. But they had no children, and when they died, the people chose a king. And the new king went mining and mining in the rock under the city, and grew more and more eager after the gold, and paid less and less heed to his people. Rapidly they sunk toward their old wickedness. But still the king went on mining, and coining gold by the pailful, until the people were worse even than in the old time. And so greedy was the king after gold, that when at last the ore began to fail, he caused the miners to reduce the pillars which Peter and they that followed him had left standing to bear the city, and from the girth of an oak of 1,000 years they chipped them down to that of a fir tree of 50. One day at noon, when life was at its highest, the whole city fell with a roaring crash. The cries of men and the shrieks of women went up with its dust, and then there was a great silence. Where the mighty rock once towered, crowded with homes and crowned with a palace, now rushes and raves a stone-obstructed rapid of the river. All around spreads a wilderness of wild deer, and the very name of Gwynstorm has ceased from the lips of men.